In this video, I want to talk about membrane transport, which is how things get into or out of cells. So remember that all cells have a cell membrane. Whether it is a prokaryotic cell or a eukaryotic cell, it has a cell membrane. And the cell membrane is made up first of lipids and then proteins, two very important biological molecules that are found in our cell membranes. The lipids are in a double layer or a bilayer. These are phospholipids, so they have phosphate heads that kind of face outside. And then the fatty acid chains that are part of the lipid are here making up the middle of this layer. Some cells also have cell walls, like the plant cells that we have been looking at under the microscope. And these cell walls are just on the outside of the cell membrane, but they don't have quite the same function as the cell membrane. They're involved more in providing support and protection. So the function of the cell membrane is first to separate what is inside the cell from what is outside the cell and not part of that cell, but also to control or to regulate the flow of materials coming into and out of the cell. So the cell membrane is acting as a gatekeeper. It's kind of in charge of the gate. The cell membrane is selectively permeable. It does not let everything in. Another word for that is semi-permeable, and because it is selectively permeable, it's really important for maintaining homeostasis, or keeping that stable internal balance in the cell by controlling how much of some substances come in or how much of some substances go out. Just thinking a little bit more about that structure of the cell membrane, we have our phospholipid bilayer, but along with that lipid bilayer we have some cholesterol, which helps provide support and keep the lipids stable in different temperatures. And then we have proteins. There are proteins that go all the way through from one side of the membrane to the other that are known as integral proteins. And those can be channel proteins or carrier proteins, and we'll keep on learning more about that in this whole video. And then there are some proteins that are just on one side that are known as peripheral proteins. They will have different functions in our channel proteins and carrier proteins. And carbohydrates and also lipids, which I forgot to add to this, can also be attached to proteins on the outside, making other types of molecules known as glycoproteins or glycolipids. What's interesting about the cell membrane is that things don't stay in the same place. Proteins actually move around the lipid bilayer, kind of like they're floating around in that lipid layer. And so we call that the fluid mosaic model, to just give us the idea that the mosaic part means there's lots of different parts in there, and it's fluid because it's moving. Here's a rather complicated image of that fluid mosaic. Well, we don't have the movement here, but of that cell membrane. And so we can see our two layers. There's our first layer of lipids, and then just flip the other way is the other layer of that phospholipid. So there's our lipid bilayer. Here are some of the proteins that go all the way through, the integral proteins. And so this is a channel protein. You can see there's a hole, a tunnel right through the middle that things can move through. Here's an integral protein that doesn't go quite so far. And then peripheral proteins, the ones that are just kind of attached to the bottom. We have our cholesterol molecules, and then here are some of these carbohydrates plus proteins, so a glycoprotein or a carbohydrate plus a lipid, a glycolipid. And all of these different types of molecules have different jobs. You can also see bits of the microfilaments or microtubules that make up the skeleton of the cell, the thing that helps that the cell have its three-dimensional structure. And they also will attach underneath the cell membrane, trying to keep the whole cell together. So things move across the cell membrane in one of two broad ways. There is passive transport and active transport. In passive transport, there is no energy necessary, which is why it's called passive. Because substances are moving from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. So it's kind of like rolling downhill. It's very easy to roll downhill. Things just move from high to low naturally. In passive transport, we see substances move through the lipid bilayer itself or through a membrane protein. In active transport, energy is needed because one of the characteristics of active transport is that things are moving from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration, which is like trying to push something uphill. It's going to take energy because you're going the opposite way from the way things naturally want to move. So active transport will be needing a membrane protein. It's not going to happen just through the lipid bilayer. And we often use vesicles for a certain type of active transport. So looking first at passive transport, there are three main types. There's diffusion, also just called simple diffusion, osmosis, which is diffusion of water, so it's just specifically what's happening with water, and then facilitated diffusion. And so this illustration down here on the left, this arrow is showing us moving right through the lipid bilayer with diffusion. Here we have moving through a channel protein, which also can happen in diffusion, and then facilitated diffusion, we need to go through a carrier protein, which is what this oval shape represents on the right. In diffusion, this is for small particles that naturally move from higher to lower concentrations because of the random movement of these molecules on the atomic level. Every single atom is vibrating and rotating and bounce around down on the atomic level, and that's what makes things diffuse. If someone is cooking bacon in your house, you're able to smell it through the whole house because of diffusion. There doesn't need to be a fan to move the air from the kitchen to your bedroom. Those particles will eventually get there because they are bouncing around by random movement. So diffusion happens because of random movement, and then it happens from high to low concentration. Substances can move directly through the cell membrane, through that lipid bilayer, or through a channel protein. And incidentally, if concentration is high enough, diffusion can be very rapid. We depend on diffusion for part of our nervous system, and you know how fast nerve impulses can move in your body. This illustration down here at the bottom is showing you diffusion happening over time, so time is passing from left to right. We start off with a high concentration outside the cell. Extracellular means outside the cell. And over time, we're seeing these numbers change. These particles are bouncing around and they're wiggling their way through and moving into this area of low concentration until at the very end we have things roughly equaled out. And then we're not going to see a change in concentration anymore. Those particles, though, are still moving back and forth across the cell membrane. You just can't tell a concentration change. Osmosis, we have a similar thing happen, but here we're looking at water. And so this is water moving across a semi-permeable membrane. So water can move, but other stuff cannot. And the water is moving between two areas with different concentrations of water plus some solute. Solute is any substance that's dissolved in water or any substance dissolved in another liquid. And so water is going to move from a low solute or a high water area to a high solute or low water area. So you look at our illustration, the solute are these little orange circles, and we have 3 solute particles on the left in our before picture, and we have 9 on the right. And in the after picture, we still have 3 solute particles on the left and 9 on the right. The membrane is keeping the solute from moving, but our water is moving. Our blue water molecules are moving. They're moving from this area where there was lots of water because there wasn't very much solute into the area where there is lots of solute but not much water. So when we get to the after picture, it's a little more even distribution of the water between the two sides because of osmosis. So movement of water in order to kind of equalize out the water is osmosis. And then finally, facilitated diffusion. This is what is used by larger molecules or molecules that have a charge, a positive or negative charge. Those are known as ions. And they need to move through a protein in the cell membrane. They are too big to just slide through the lipid bilayer. They can't just go through simple diffusion. That's not going to work for them. They need to be moved by something. They need to go through the protein channel or through this tunnel that provides protection, especially for charged molecules. It lets them slide right through. And again, notice we have high concentration on one side and low on the other, so we're going with the concentration gradient, going from high to low. Those are the channel proteins. And then carrier proteins have a real interesting thing because they physically will carry large molecules across the cell membrane, but they don't need energy to do it because there is a change in their shape that sort of drags the molecule from one side to the other. This is because of attraction, positive and negative attraction of the different parts of these molecules, but it's not something that requires energy. So this molecule will be attracted to the carrier protein. That's going to make the carrier protein change its shape, and then that will put that piece of substance on the other side of the membrane. In facilitated diffusion, as all types of passive transport, we are moving from high to low, and we call that moving with the concentration gradient. So if you see something's moved with the concentration gradient, it's moving from a high concentration area to a low concentration area. So moving on to active transport, there are two ways that active transport happens in cells. It's through a carrier protein, and because these proteins are using energy, they're often called protein pumps. And then something called bulk transport that uses vesicles, and of that we have two types. Endocytosis brings things in, and exocytosis takes things out. So in active transport, we are working with a carrier protein, and a little bit of energy is needed by our little star, or we are using the membrane itself in the form of a vesicle. So let's talk first about these carrier proteins or protein pumps. These are used by molecules of any size that have to move from a low concentration to a high concentration. So that's the opposite way. That's like pushing something uphill. And so the carrier protein is necessary to drag that molecule from this area of low concentration over and stuff it in this area of high concentration. And in order for that to happen, you must have energy because you're having to do a lot of work. The energy molecule in the cell is known as ATP. We've mentioned that a little bit in talking about our biological molecules because it is a nucleotide, a single nucleotide, but we'll be hearing more about that as we go on. And so you have to have a carrier protein, you have to apply energy because you're taking things from a low concentration to a high concentration or going against the concentration gradient. Then bulk transport is the last type of active transport, and this is the movement of very large molecules or substances that get enclosed in a vesicle. So if there's something outside that the cell wants to bring in, part of the cell membrane is sent out to engulf or to surround that substance and then turn that into a vesicle and bring that substance into the cell, draw it in. And if there's something in the cell that needs to go out, then the vesicle filled with that substance is carried to or moved to the outer cell membrane and then can open up and release the material to the outside environment. So endo means bringing something in, so endocytosis is bringing the material in, and exocytosis is putting it out, like exiting. So our illustration shows how we have a food particle that's going to be taken in by endocytosis. So here this food particle is going to be surrounded by the cell membrane. This will happen because there are those microfilaments and microtubules that the skeleton of the cell can push the cell membrane around, and so it'll push it out and around this food particle and eventually close it off at the top, making a vesicle. And then a lysosome will come in and connect to that vesicle. So here's a lysosome has fused with that vesicle, and it forms what is known as a secondary lysosome because the lysosome in the cell is being added to this little vesicle that's being made by endocytosis. And lysosome, of course, breaks down products and takes out the trash, so it'll digest that food particle. The things that can be used by the cell will be moving out of the lysosome and put into the cytoplasm where it can be taken. Those particles can be taken wherever they need to. And then our waste products will be then in that lysosome will be taken to the cell membrane. The membranes will match up and fuse together, and then it will open up and dump the waste out to dump the trash out. And so because we're moving vesicles, we're moving really big things around in the cell, you do need energy to push and pull those particles. They don't just kind of float on their own, but they are actively moved by the cytoskeleton, by the microtubules and microfilaments inside the cell, and a lot of ATP. So in summary, and I don't know why I have 2 lines on this page, that's strange. But in summary, the cell membrane controls what can come in or go out of the cell. So every substance that's absorbed, that moves in, or released from the cell uses one of these cell membrane transport methods. Different substances will use different methods, or sometimes the same substance will use a different method in a different place in the organism. Just for an example, the oxygen that we take in, we breathe, moves through our body because of diffusion. So that's happening by diffusion. It's just diffusing into the cells from the lungs or into the bloodstream and then into the cells. Glucose that comes from the food we eat moves into cells by facilitated diffusion. It needs a carrier protein to move it in. Amino acids that we need to build protein are moved out of the digestive system by active transport into the cells. And then cholesterol, which is necessary for making the cells, is taken in by endocytosis, or actually the LDL, the low-density lipoprotein that is carrying the cholesterol in the bloodstream, which is a rather large molecule, is taken into the cell by endocytosis. So these transport methods are how things move into and out of the cells to help the cells have the materials they need to get rid of the waste products that they don't need and to keep everything working to keep those organisms alive.